We are his children.
A grieving duke, an heir lost to the sea, and a bloodline turned to dust. But what happens when the most powerful man in England visits his son's tomb, only to find two identical children placing roses on the marble? 3 whispered words would rewrite history. Stay with me. The autumn of 1819 descended upon Yorkshire, not with a gentle turn of leaves, but with a bitter, biting frost that stripped the ancient oaks bare and turned the sprawling grounds of the Harrington estate into a desolate wasteland. For Arthur Stirling, the 9th Duke of Harrington, the bleakness of the landscape was a mirror to his own soul. He was a man composed of rigid protocols, immense wealth, and unyielding pride, a patriarch who had commanded the respect of the House of Lords and the fear of his enemies. Yet, all the power in the British Empire could not bring back the dead. To understand the Duke's profound isolation, one had to understand the tragedy of his lineage. Arthur's wife, the Duchess Beatrice, had passed away of consumption over a decade prior, leaving him with a single, precious heir, his son, Thomas. Thomas Stirling was everything his father was not. Where Arthur was iron, Thomas was fire. Where the Duke saw political alliances, duty, and the cold calculation of estate management, the young Lord Stirling saw poetry, passion, and the inherent equality of men. It was a dichotomy that bred a deep, underlying affection, but also inevitable, catastrophic conflict. The rupture that ultimately broke the Harrington family occurred 2 years before the frost of 1819. The Duke, seeking to solidify his political influence in the North, had arranged a marriage for Thomas with Lady Catherine Abernathy, the daughter of a prominent earl. It was an impeccable match on paper, uniting 2 vast fortunes and securing a legacy that would echo for centuries. But Thomas had categorically refused. The argument had taken place in the Duke's private library, a cavernous room filled with the scent of old leather bindings and the heavy smoke of imported cigars. Arthur remembered the scene with agonizing clarity, the rain lashing against the leaded glass windows, the fire crackling in the hearth, and his son standing before him, defiant and unyielding. "I will not marry Lady Catherine," Thomas had declared, his voice steady despite the fury radiating from his father. "My heart is already pledged, father. Pledged to a woman of true virtue, a woman who loves me for who I am, not for the coronet I stand to inherit." Arthur had scoffed, slamming his fist onto the mahogany desk. "A woman of virtue? You speak of that shopkeeper's daughter in London. A commoner, Thomas. You would throw away 1,000 years of Stirling history for a fleeting infatuation with a penniless nobody? You are bewitched by a pretty face and foolish romantic ideals." "Her name is Genevieve," Thomas replied, his eyes flashing with the distinct Harrington gray, a piercing storm cloud color that had been the hallmark of their bloodline since the Norman conquest. "And she is worth 100 Lady Catherines. You love your titles more than your own flesh and blood, father. I will not sacrifice my life at the altar of your ambition." The words had cut deep, and in his wrath, Arthur had made the greatest mistake of his life. He delivered an ultimatum. "If you walk out those doors and choose this vagabond over your duty, you are no longer a Stirling. You will be disinherited, cut off from the family coffers, and your name will be struck from the registry. You will leave with nothing but the clothes on your back." Arthur had fully expected the boy to break, to realize the harsh reality of a life without privilege and come crawling back to the fold. Instead, Thomas had simply nodded, turned on his heel, and walked out into the driving rain. He never looked back. For 6 months, pride kept the Duke from searching for his son. He convinced himself that Thomas was merely learning a difficult lesson, suffering the indignities of poverty until he was ready to accept his responsibilities. But then, the letter arrived. It was brought by a weary maritime official, the wax seal broken, the parchment stained with salt water. Thomas, seeking to make his own way in the world, had taken passage on a merchant vessel bound for the West Indies, hoping to secure work on a plantation. The ship, the HMS Valiant, had been caught in a catastrophic gale off the coast of Cornwall. It was torn apart against the jagged rocks. There were no survivors. The news had aged Arthur 20 years in a single night. The formidable Duke of Harrington, the lion of the peerage, was reduced to a hollow, trembling ghost of a man. He had his son's empty casket buried in the family crypt, a massive stone mausoleum situated on a lonely hill overlooking the estate. Since that day, Arthur's life had become a monument to routine and regret. He withdrew from society, turning the administration of his estates over to stewards, and spent his days wandering the echoing halls of Harrington Manor. His only solace, his only penance, was his weekly pilgrimage to the mausoleum. Every Sunday, regardless of the weather, the Duke would walk the 2 miles from the manor to the crypt, carrying a single white rose, the flower Thomas had always clipped from the gardens as a boy. It was a punishment he inflicted upon himself, a weekly reminder of the pride that had driven his only child to a watery grave. He believed his bloodline was severed, his legacy turned to dust, and his future condemned to absolute solitude. The morning of November 14th was particularly unforgiving. A thick, oppressive fog had rolled in off the moors, blanketing the graveyard in a pale, damp shroud that muted the sounds of the surrounding countryside. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying pine needles. Arthur, wrapped in a heavy sable coat, leaned heavily on his silver-tipped cane as he navigated the crunching gravel path toward the family plot. He was 62 years old, but the grief had carved deep canyons into his face and turned his once dark hair to the color of winter ash. As he approached the wrought iron gates of the Harrington Cemetery, the cold metal biting through his leather gloves, he paused. Something was wrong. The heavy iron gate, which was always locked by the groundskeeper and opened only for the Duke, was slightly ajar. Arthur's brow furrowed in immediate irritation. The cemetery was strictly private, a sacred ground meant only for the Sterling lineage. Poachers and vagrants occasionally wandered onto the outer limits of the estate, but none dared approach the mausoleum. Gripping his cane tighter, a spark of his old authoritative fire returning, he pushed the gate open. The rusted hinges let out a long, mournful squeal that echoed through the mist. He stepped into the graveyard, his eyes scanning the fog. The towering marble angels and weathered headstones looked like ghostly sentinels in the haze. As he drew closer to the grand domed structure of his son's final resting place, the Duke froze. There were figures moving near the steps of the mausoleum. Arthur's irritation flared into outright anger. "Who goes there?" he barked, his baritone voice slicing through the heavy air. "You are trespassing on private land. Show yourselves at once." The figures stopped. Out of the fog, the silhouette of a woman emerged. She was slender, dressed in a threadbare, dark woolen pelisse that offered little protection against the biting cold. A simple black bonnet obscured her hair, and her posture was defensive, as if she were shielding something or someone from the Duke's wrath. "I demand to know who you are and what business you have at this tomb," Arthur commanded, closing the distance between them. His cane struck the stone path with sharp, aggressive clacks. The woman did not retreat. As Arthur stepped within 10 paces, he could finally see her face clearly. She was young, perhaps no more than 22, with a striking, unconventional beauty. Her skin was pale and drawn, her cheekbones sharp from apparent hunger or exhaustion, but her eyes were remarkably clear and defiant. "We mean no disrespect, Your Grace," the woman said. Her voice was soft but completely steady, devoid of the trembling reverence the Duke was accustomed to hearing from commoners. She knew exactly who he was. "Disrespect?" Arthur spat, gesturing wildly toward the tomb with his cane. "This is the resting place of my son, Lord Thomas Sterling. It is not a public park for wanderers. Leave this instant, or I shall have my gamekeepers escort you off the property by force." It was then that the woman shifted slightly to the side, revealing what she had been hiding behind her skirts. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. Huddled together against the chill of the marble steps were two small children. They were identical twins, no more than 3 years old, wrapped in patched but meticulously clean wool coats. One was a boy, the other a girl. They were holding a small, clumsily tied bouquet of wild autumn asters, clearly intending to place them at the door of the crypt. "I said, leave," Arthur repeated, but the authority had suddenly evaporated from his voice. His gaze was locked on the children. The little boy, irritated by the loud voice of the stranger, stepped forward protectively in front of his sister. He scowled at the Duke. It was a specific, stubborn pinching of the brow, accompanied by a slight jutting of the lower lip. Arthur's heart slammed against his ribs. It was the exact same scowl Thomas used to wear when he was a toddler and was denied a toy in the nursery. The Duke took a hesitant, trembling step forward. The fog seemed to recede, leaving only the sharp reality of the children before him. The boy had an unruly mop of dark hair, exactly like Thomas's. But it was when the little girl peeked out from behind her brother that Arthur felt the world completely drop away beneath his feet. The girl looked up at the towering Duke, tilting her head in innocent curiosity. Her eyes met his. They were gray. Not just any gray, but the piercing, storm cloud gray of the Harrington line, complete with the distinct, dark charcoal ring around the outer edge of the iris. It was a genetic signature so rare and so dominant in the Sterling family that a portrait gallery stretching back 400 years displayed the exact same gaze on generations of earls and dukes. Arthur dropped his white rose. It landed silently on the wet gravel. His mind raced, a violent collision of impossible hope and terrifying reality. The timeline. Thomas had left in the spring of 1817. He died in the autumn. These children were around 3 years old. It was biologically possible, but how? Why had he not been told? Who was this woman? Who? Arthur started, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate wheeze. The fearsome Duke of Harrington was suddenly trembling like a leaf in the wind. He pointed a shaking, gloved finger at the twins. Who are they? What is this trickery? The woman, standing tall despite her ragged clothes, reached down and gently placed a hand on each of the children's shoulders. She looked at the old man, seeing past the terrifying reputation of the Duke to the broken, grieving father underneath. She did not gloat, nor did she cower. She held his gaze, her own eyes brimming with unshed tears as she spoke the 3 words that would shatter Arthur Sterling's world forever. These are his. The cane slipped from Arthur's grasp, clattering loudly against the stone steps. The strength utterly vanished from his legs. For the first time in his long, proud, and uncompromising life, the Duke of Harrington collapsed. He fell to his knees in the cold, wet mud of the graveyard, heedless of the freezing damp seeping through his trousers. He stared at the 2 tiny, living ghosts of his dead son, the breath tearing out of his lungs in ragged, uncontrollable sobs. The bloodline was not broken. The legacy was not dead. Amidst the graves of his ancestors, life had miraculously, impossibly, returned to him. The biting wind howling across the Yorkshire moors went entirely unnoticed by the Duke of Harrington. Still kneeling in the damp earth, Arthur stared at the little girl with the unmistakable storm cloud eyes, his breath hitching in his chest. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand, afraid that if he touched her, she might vanish like the morning mist. Genevieve did not pull the children away. She watched with a mixture of profound exhaustion and wary pity as the most formidable man in England broke down before her. "My son," Arthur whispered, the words tearing at his throat. He looked up at Genevieve, his patrician features crumpled in agony. You are the woman he spoke of, Genevieve." "Yes, Your Grace," she replied quietly. Her voice was steady, hardened by years of surviving the brutal streets of London without a protector. "I am Genevieve Sterling, and these are your grandchildren, Henry and Victoria." At the sound of his surname upon her lips, Arthur let out a choked sound. He forced himself to his feet, leaning heavily on his silver-tipped cane. his joints protesting the freezing damp. The towering oak doors of the mausoleum loomed behind them, holding only an empty casket and the ashes of Arthur's pride. But here, breathing the cold air, was the very flesh and blood he thought he had extinguished. "You will come with me," Arthur commanded. It was not a request. It was the desperate plea of a starving man offered a feast. "You cannot stay out in this chill. The children are shivering." Genevieve hesitated. The manor house on the hill was a fortress of wealth and privilege, the very place from which her husband had been ruthlessly banished. "We only came to say goodbye, Your Grace. I have secured passage on a parish cart to the workhouse in York. We have nothing left. I only wanted Henry and Victoria to see where their father slept before we surrendered to the parish authorities." The word workhouse struck Arthur like a physical blow. The grandchildren of the Duke of Harrington, the heirs to a fortune that spanned counties, facing the squalor and cruelty of a workhouse, the sheer horror of his own hubris washed over him. "No," Arthur said, his voice suddenly regaining a fraction of its old thunderous authority. "No sterling will ever cross the threshold of a workhouse. You are coming home, all of you." The walk back to Harrington Manor was a silent procession. When they arrived at the towering iron gates of the estate, the footmen stood paralyzed in shock. They had watched their master leave an hour prior as a hollow, grieving ghost. He returned covered in graveyard mud, flanking a woman in threadbare wool and 2 toddlers clutching withered flowers. "Mrs. Hughes," Arthur bellowed as he crossed the grand threshold into the cavernous entrance hall, his voice echoing off the marble pillars. The formidable housekeeper, a woman who had served the estate for 30 years, came rushing from the servants' quarters. When her eyes fell upon little Henry, whose dark curls and stubborn scowl were a mirror image of the boy she had once chased through these very halls, she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Prepare the main nursery," Arthur ordered, shedding his heavy sable coat and tossing it to a stunned footman. "Draw hot baths. Have the cook prepare warm broths, roasted meats, whatever they desire. And send for Dr. Arbuthnot immediately to examine them for the chill." Within hours, the dead, silent atmosphere of Harrington Manor was completely shattered. For the first time in years, the sounds of small footsteps and childish murmurs echoed in the corridors. Once the children were bathed, fed, and tucked into the massive feather beds of the nursery, Arthur summoned Genevieve to his private library. It was the very same room where he had banished Thomas. The heavy mahogany desk, the crackling hearth, the scent of aged leather, everything was exactly as it had been on that fateful night. Genevieve entered the room wearing a borrowed gown of dark blue silk that had belonged to the late Duchess. It hung slightly loose on her starved frame, but it transformed her. With her face washed and her hair pinned back, her striking, intelligent beauty was undeniable. Arthur stood by the fire, holding a glass of brandy he had barely touched. "Sit, please," he offered, gesturing to a velvet armchair. For a long moment, the only sound was the popping of the logs in the fireplace. Arthur stared into the flames. "Why did he not tell me?" the Duke finally asked, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Why did Thomas not tell me you were with child?" "Because he did not know, Your Grace," Genevieve answered softly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "We were married in secret the morning after he left this house. He had nothing to his name but his pride and his love for me. He promised he would build a fortune in the West Indies, enough to buy a small farm where we could live in peace." She swallowed hard, fighting back the painful memories. "He boarded the HMS Valiant in May. I realized I was carrying the twins a week later. I wrote to the shipping company, hoping a message could be sent to intercept him in Jamaica, but the storm took him before he ever reached the open ocean." Arthur closed his eyes, a tear finally escaping and tracing the deep lines of his weathered cheek. "When the news of the shipwreck reached London, I was entirely alone," Genevieve continued. "I tried to find work as a seamstress, but carrying twins, my health failed. We lived in a miserable garret in Cheapside. I sold my wedding ring to buy milk for the babies. I survived on scraps so they could eat. I considered coming to you 100 times, but I remembered the words Thomas told me. He said his father was a man of iron who cared only for titles and pedigree. I was terrified you would take my babies from me and throw me back into the streets. The brutal honesty of her words cut Arthur to the bone, because she was right. 3 years ago, he might have done exactly that. The Duke walked over to Genevieve and did something he had never done in his 62 years of life. He knelt before her. He took her small, calloused hands in his own. "I am a proud, foolish, and arrogant old man," Arthur wept, his shoulders shaking. "My pride killed my son. It nearly starved his wife and children. I cannot bring Thomas back, Genevieve. I would trade every acre, every title, every ounce of gold I possess to have him stand in this room one more time. But I swear to you, on my life, you will never know hunger again. They are my blood. You are my daughter. This is your home." For the first time since Thomas's death, Genevieve let her own tears fall, the immense, crushing burden of survival finally lifting from her shoulders. But the warmth of their reconciliation was destined to be short-lived. In the aristocratic world of 19th century England, titles and fortunes were never left to sentimentality. They were governed by the ruthless, unyielding laws of primogeniture and the Court of Chancery. And the Harrington dukedom was the greatest prize of all. News of the Duke's sudden acquisition of 2 heirs spread through the servant ranks faster than a plague. By Tuesday morning, a letter had been discreetly dispatched by a bribed footman, racing toward London in the saddlebags of a post-rider. Its destination, the opulent townhouse of Lord Reginald Stirling. Reginald was Arthur's nephew, the son of the Duke's late younger brother. At 35, Reginald was a man of exquisite tailoring, expensive tastes, and catastrophic gambling debts. Since the confirmation of Thomas's death, Reginald had comfortably assumed the mantle of heir presumptive. He had already begun borrowing heavily against his future inheritance, anticipating the day his elderly uncle would finally expire and leave him the keys to the Harrington empire. When the letter arrived, detailing the sudden appearance of a widow and twin toddlers possessing the Harrington gray eyes, Reginald nearly choked on his morning claret. Within 24 hours, Reginald's carriage, drawn by 4 exhausted horses, thundered up the gravel drive of Harrington Manor. He burst through the front doors like a tempest, his handsome face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation. "Where is he?" Reginald demanded of the startled Mrs. Hughes, stripping off his driving gloves. He found his uncle in the sunlit morning room. The sight that greeted Reginald made his blood boil. The fearsome Duke of Harrington, a man who regularly terrified the House of Lords, was sitting on a Persian rug. He was awkwardly but enthusiastically helping a little boy build a wobbly tower out of wooden blocks, while a little girl sat on his lap, happily pulling at the gold watch chain on his waistcoat. Genevieve sat nearby, embroidering, a soft smile on her lips. Reginald cleared his throat loudly, leaning against the doorframe. "Uncle, I see the rumors of your sudden domestication are entirely true." Arthur looked up, his expression instantly hardening back into the cold, impenetrable mask of the Duke. He carefully moved Victoria from his lap and stood up, dusting off his trousers. "Reginald, to what do I owe this unannounced intrusion?" "Intrusion?" Reginald stepped into the room, his eyes raking over Genevieve with undisguised contempt. "I am your heir, uncle. It is my duty to protect the estate from opportunists and charlatans. I received word that you have taken in a beggar woman and her bastards." "Watch your tongue, Reginald," Arthur warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. "You are speaking of Lady Genevieve Stirling, your cousin's widow. And this boy," he pointed to Henry, who was glaring at Reginald, "is the future Duke of Harrington." Reginald laughed, a sharp, barking sound devoid of any humor. "Are we to play make-believe, uncle? Because a common shop girl crawls out of the London gutters with a pair of brats who happen to have dark hair. You intend to hand over one of the oldest titles in Britain?" "They possess the Harrington eyes," Arthur countered, stepping forward. "And I know my son's features when I see them." "Eyes are not legal tender in the Court of Chancery, uncle," Reginald snapped, his polite veneer shattering. "The Harrington estate is strictly entailed. The title can only pass to a legitimate male heir born in holy wedlock. You disinherited Thomas before he left. There was no announcement, no banns read in a proper church, no society wedding. This woman is a whore, and her children are base-born byblows." "Get out!" Arthur roared, his face flushing violently crimson. He grabbed his cane, looking as though he might strike his nephew with it. "Get out of my house before I have you thrown out." "I will not," Reginald sneered, pulling a folded legal document from his breast pocket and tossing it onto a side table. "I have already consulted with my solicitors. Even if Thomas did father these children, if there is no legal, irrefutable proof of a recognized marriage, the entailment dictates the estate passes to me. I will not allow you to give my inheritance away out of misplaced, senile guilt." Genevieve stood up, her hands trembling, but her posture perfectly straight. "Thomas and I were married," she said, her voice ringing out clearly in the tense room. "On the 12th of May, 1817, at the parish of St. Jude's, in Cheapside, by the Reverend Josiah Higgins. We have a marriage certificate." A piece of paper easily forged by any penny clerk in Covent Garden, Reginald dismissed with a wave of his hand. "The House of Lords will demand the official parish registry. The heavy bound book kept under lock and key by the church itself. If your names are not in that book, your children are bastards in the eyes of the crown." A sinister, terrifyingly confident smile crept across Reginald's face. He stepped closer to Arthur, lowering his voice. "It is a pity, Uncle, how easily fires start in those old wooden London parishes. How a single knocked-over candle can turn decades of records to ash. Or how a poor clergyman, faced with a sudden windfall of £1,000, might discover that a specific page of his registry has been accidentally torn out." Arthur's blood ran cold. He stared at his nephew, finally seeing the man for the venomous snake he truly was. Reginald hadn't just rushed to Yorkshire to argue. He was buying time. He had already sent men to London to destroy the evidence. "You wouldn't dare," Arthur whispered, horrified. "I am merely pointing out the fragility of paper, Uncle," Reginald replied smoothly, buttoning his coat. "You have 1 week before I file a formal injunction in Chancery to have these children legally declared illegitimate and expelled from the succession. Let us see if your new family can survive the scrutiny of the law." With a mocking bow, Reginald turned on his heel and strode out of the room, leaving a suffocating silence in his wake. Genevieve collapsed back into her chair, a hand flying to her mouth as terror gripped her. Without the parish registry, Henry and Victoria would be branded illegitimate. They would be stripped of their names, their inheritance, and cast back out into the unforgiving world. Reginald would win. Arthur stood utterly still for a long moment. He looked at the little boy on the rug, who had resumed playing with his blocks, blissfully unaware that his entire future was currently burning to the ground. When the Duke finally turned to Genevieve, the grieving, repentant old man from the library was gone. In his place stood the ruthless, calculating titan of industry and politics who had ruled his domain with an iron fist for 40 years. The lion had been awakened. "Genevieve," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Go to the nursery. Pack a trunk for yourself and the children. We leave for London within the hour." He marched toward the door, bellowing for his staff. "Mrs. Hughes, send a boy to the stables. I want my fastest carriage, 4 of our strongest drawing horses, and an outrider. Then, fetch me a pen and parchment. I need a rider to go ahead to the city to find my solicitor, Mr. Pendleton. Tell him to hire the meanest Bow Street runners he can find and send them to St. Jude's in Cheapside." Arthur paused in the doorway, his gray eyes flashing with a predatory light. Reginald thinks he knows how to play this game, but he forgets who wrote the rules. The journey down the Great North Road was a grueling test of endurance. The Duke's customized carriage, emblazoned with the Harrington crest, tore through the rain-slicked mud of the English countryside at a breakneck pace. Inside the velvet-lined cabin, the tension was palpable. Arthur sat rigid, his pocket watch snapping open and shut in his gloved hand every few miles, while Genevieve held Henry and Victoria close, whispering soothing words as the carriage violently pitched and rolled. They reached the sprawling, soot-choked metropolis of London on the evening of the fourth day. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and raw sewage. Arthur's carriage did not stop at his luxurious Mayfair townhouse. Instead, it thundered directly toward the cramped, winding streets of the city's legal district. They pulled up outside the dimly lit offices of Pendleton and Smith. Josiah Pendleton, a sharply dressed solicitor with a mind like a steel trap, was waiting on the cobblestones. The grim set of his jaw told Arthur everything he needed to know before the carriage door even opened. "You are too late, Your Grace," Pendleton said quietly, as Arthur stepped down into the freezing drizzle. "I dispatched 3 of the best Bow Street runners to Cheapside the moment your rider arrived, but by the time they reached Jude's, the vestry was fully engulfed in flames." Genevieve let out a stifled sob from inside the carriage. "The fire brigade managed to save the nave, but the parish archives are gone," Pendleton continued, his voice heavy with defeat. "Every birth, death, and marriage registry for the past 50 years has been reduced to white ash. The local magistrate suspects arson. A ragged fellow named Bartholomew Crump was seen fleeing the alleyway with a pocket full of newly minted sovereigns. But without the ledger, Reginald has exactly what he needs." Arthur's fists clenched so tightly, the leather of his gloves creaked. "Where is my nephew?" "He has already filed the petition, Your Grace," Pendleton replied. "The emergency hearing is set for tomorrow morning at Lincoln's Inn Hall. Lord Chancellor Eldon himself is presiding. Reginald's barristers will petition the Court of Chancery to officially strike the children from the line of succession due to lack of documented legitimacy." That night, in the cavernous, silent rooms of the Harrington townhouse, Genevieve sat by the nursery fire, watching her twins sleep. The fight was over. The law required absolute proof, and Reginald had burned it. She prepared herself for the inevitable return to poverty, praying Arthur might at least provide a small stipend to keep the children from the workhouse. But when dawn broke, Arthur Sterling did not look like a defeated man. He appeared at the breakfast table, wearing his finest dark wool tailcoat, his silver hair impeccably brushed, the Harrington signet ring gleaming on his finger. The fearsome aura of the Duke had returned in full force. "Gather the children, Genevieve," Arthur commanded. "We are going to court." Lincoln's Inn Hall was a magnificent, imposing structure of stained glass and dark oak, filled with the murmurs of gowned barristers and clerks. At the center of the high bench sat John Scott, Lord Eldon, the Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain. He was a man of immense power, known for his strict adherence to the letter of the law. Reginald stood at the plaintiff's table, looking nauseatingly triumphant in a burgundy silk waistcoat. When Arthur, Genevieve, and the twins entered the hall, flanked by Mr. Pendleton, Reginald offered a mocking, theatrical bow. "A tragic day, Unc," Reginald sneered across the aisle. "I heard the news regarding St. Jude's. Such a devastating accident. It seems Providence itself refuses to let the Harrington name be sullied by undocumented gutter rats." Arthur did not even look at him. He took his seat, placing his cane between his knees, his face carved from granite. Lord Eldon struck his gavel, silencing the hall. "The Court of Chancery is in session. We are here to address the petition of Lord Reginald Sterling regarding the legitimacy of the minor children, Henry and Victoria, and their claim to the Harrington entailment." "Lord Reginald, you assert these children are baseborn?" Reginald's lead barrister, a pompous man named Fitzwilliam, stood up. "Indeed, my lord. The woman, Genevieve, claims a marriage took place at St. Jude's in Cheapside. However, as the court is aware, the parish vestry tragically burned to the ground 2 nights ago. Without the official registry, the marriage cannot be verified under the Marriage Act of 1753. We ask the court to declare the children illegitimate, securing Lord Reginald's rightful place as heir presumptive." Lord Eldon peered down his spectacles at Arthur. Your Grace, this is a heavy claim. Do you have the parish registry? I do not, my lord, Arthur said, his voice echoing clearly through the vaulted hall. My nephew saw to its destruction quite thoroughly. Reginald leapt to his feet. I object to this slander. Sit down, Reginald, Lord Eldon barked, before turning back to Arthur. Your Grace, without the registry, the law is clear. The children cannot inherit. I am well aware of the law, Lord Eldon, Arthur said, a slow, predatory smile finally touching his lips. He nodded to his solicitor. Mr. Pendleton, if you please. Mr. Pendleton stood, opening his leather briefcase. My lord, it is true the parish records of St. Jude's are ashes, and had Lord Thomas Sterling been a common laborer, Reginald's vile scheme would have succeeded. Pendleton pulled a heavy, folded piece of vellum from his case. It was bound in red ribbon and bore a massive, unmistakable wax seal. However, Pendleton continued, his voice rising in triumph. Lord Thomas knew his cousin Reginald was a viper. He knew the danger his new wife would face if anything happened to him. Therefore, Thomas did not merely rely on a local parish vicar to secure his legacy. Reginald's smug smile vanished. The color drained completely from his face. Before he boarded the ship to the West Indies, Pendleton declared, holding the document high, Lord Thomas Sterling utilized his aristocratic privilege. He wrote to Doctors' Commons and petitioned directly for a special license. This document, my lord, is an exact copy of the marriage lines between Thomas Sterling and Genevieve, authorized, signed, and sealed by Charles Manners Sutton, the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. The courtroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers. Reginald gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles turning white, looking as though he might be sick. The original document has been securely resting in the impenetrable vaults of the faculty office since May of 1817, Pendleton finished, handing the vellum to the court clerk to pass up to the bench. Neither fire nor my Lord Reginald's hired thugs could ever reach it. Lord Eldon examined the heavy wax seal and the Archbishop's signature. He looked up, his eyes resting coldly on Reginald. This seal is absolute and irrefutable, Lord Eldon announced, his voice booming over the whispers. The marriage is recognized by the highest spiritual and legal authorities in the realm. The children are legitimate heirs. Lord Reginald's petition is dismissed with extreme prejudice. Eldon leaned forward, glaring at the trembling nephew. And I would advise you, Lord Reginald, to leave London immediately. A formal investigation into the arson at St. Jude's will be opened by the Crown by nightfall. If I were you, I would find a very fast ship bound for the continent. Reginald did not say a word. Ruined, drowning in debt, and now facing criminal charges, he turned and fled the courtroom, his footsteps echoing wildly against the stone floors. He was never seen in England again. Arthur turned to Genevieve, who was weeping, tears of profound, overwhelming relief, clutching little Henry and Victoria to her chest. The Duke reached out, wrapping his strong arms around his daughter-in-law and his grandchildren, shielding them from the staring crowds of the court. It is over, Arthur whispered, the storm clouds in his gray eyes finally giving way to a bright, peaceful dawn. You are safe. You are Sterling's, and we are going home. The Duke's legacy is finally safe, and Reginald's greed was his ultimate undoing. But what did you think of Arthur's redemption and Genevieve's incredible courage? If this historical drama kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow romance lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories of love, betrayal, and triumph. See you next time.
Hi, my name is Primal Bond Living, the owner and manager of Primal Bond Living. After watching the video, the Duke found twins at his son's grave, and just 3 words brought him to his knees. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the deep sense of grief mixed with unexpected hope. Historical romance stories often carry so much emotion because people hide their pain behind duty, status, or pride, and then one simple moment changes everything. I think the quiet heartbreak in this story made the emotional connection feel even stronger, especially when the truth finally began to surface. Do you think the Duke would have made different choices if he had known the truth sooner? And have you ever experienced a moment where just a few words completely changed the way you saw someone or understood a situation? Stories like this remind me that love, loss, and family can leave lasting marks on people no matter how much time passes. If this story connected with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional historical romance stories like this, feel free to like and subscribe for more whenever you'd like.